سريع لنداء اللي رح يحكي عن شغل اليوم في دارة وشغل السابق ومشروعاته المستقبلية. نداء يعمل في مجال الفن والسينما، ولد في الجزائر وعاش في أمريكا قبل أن يرجع إلى فلسطين، ويخرج فيلم موال فلسطين أو Palestinian-American اللي رح يعرض الثلاثاء القادم. يركز نداء في أعماله الفنية على تحويل المواد الاعتيادية إلى تجربة حسية، وهو ما نراه في معرضه كرافان، المعرض الفردي الأول له في المنطقة.
Thank you all for coming. I'd like to just start by thanking Darat al Funun and their amazing staff for really helping me realize this show. It's been a lot of hard work. And especially dear Fennan for her amazing, everything that she's done here really is incredible. And I know everybody repeats it, but it's worth repeating one more time. This place is really a gem. And here to start. So thank you very much. And welcome all. I'll try to keep this as informal as possible. So if anybody has any questions and would like to interject at any time, please feel free. Maybe I'll start at the beginning. I think I see this entire exhibition as a representation of the Palestinian landscape. And I felt it fitting to have the show here, especially in the main house, because of the history it shares with Palestine. And what we see here is an amazing preservation of history. You can see it in the building, in the spirit of the people that work here, in the floor tiles, most literally, that were made in Memphis more than 80 years ago. And what's really shocking is that you have to come here almost to get a glimpse of the history of Palestine. In fact, even the current history, which is being erased from the landscape at an increasingly rapid pace. And what I see in Palestine, I think what a lot of people see in Palestine is an increasing trend towards turning or creating a new middle class. So turning the used to be the rural population that lived more or less sustainably in the environment into a middle class that works in the de facto capitals, oftentimes supported by the NGO parks that spring up all over Palestine, especially Ramallah and other cities. So what we're seeing is something that, well, I think Moshe Dayan said it best in a quote to Haaretz in 1963 in reference to the Bedouin population of the Negev. He wanted to enact a series of policies to get rid of the Bedouins because they wanted to take their land. The Bedouins are free roaming and don't abide by Ottoman land laws, so it was relatively simple for them to do so. But the plan was to create housing for them and nominal positions, laboring positions, in urban centers. So in other words, he was set on creating an urban proletariat from a population that was by definition rural. And what I see now in Palestine is a similar policy in that we are creating a new working middle class that didn't exist before. So what do you have to do that? Well, you have to have a situation where people are desperate, and the Israelis took care of that for us. So once you take away all the farmers' farmlands and all the shepherds' grazing lands, they're forced to seek other forms of employment and to move to the urban centers where there is no shortage of housing for them. And right now you see a plethora of campaigns in Palestine echoed in the billboard that's in the banner that's hanging above the main house, advertising low interest rates, cheap mortgages, this, that, and the other. But what that does essentially, two things. I mean, it changes the physical nature of the landscape. So we lose the houses with the beautiful old tiles and the history and its relationship to the green surroundings, and we create massive skyscrapers, very, very large buildings. And so what you see in this room around you is what you don't see, is what's in the shadow of those buildings. And these are the, what I'm calling caravans, the the mobile office units that house guards and the workforce that build these buildings. So just outside the frame of every one of these photographs is a massive building, but I chose to frame them out and to focus on these structures because I find the political economy is very interesting. Of course, you all might know Palestine has no access to ports, so all of these shipping containers arrive through Israel, and they start off as we later discovered as hilltop caravans that settlers use to control the landscape. And then once the Israeli settlement is built and established, once its concrete is set, there's no use for them. So where do they go? They're sold to Palestinians that in turn use them to build these low interest rate houses that in a way serve to house the dispossessed. We have to be brave enough to engage in thinking of dispossession no longer as a national issue of liberation and struggle, but as an economic issue. And that's really the concern. What is going to happen is I guess, the overarching question of the show. And for me, it is debt, pure and simple. So, whereas people used to be beholden to their olive trees and their lands for generations, they are now going to be beholden to the big businesses and investment companies that construct these Palestinian quote-unquote settlements. And so the work downstairs looks at this notion of debt from 3 points of view. The first being divine debt. So you might ask yourself, why are human beings so easily swayed into this notion of servitude and debt? And we might look as far back as the Old Testament. And so the piece I have downstairs, one of the pieces called Yuna's Whale, refers to the story of debt, of a divine nature. And this is something that's deeply ingrained in our DNA. And the idea of the whale I felt fitting because for the caravan, because the same way that the caravans, the Israeli caravans, have swallowed the country, and this whale has swallowed Yuna. And then I went about extracting this mythical character from the caravan, and in order to do that, I had to slice it. And in order to come to terms with the violence that these structures have in relation to our nation, I had to take a very aggressive act, I think you could say. And that's where the cutting, the slicing began. And in doing so, I kept unearthing or uncovering deeper and deeper layers. In the piece downstairs, I would make a cut and I would discover a Russian language newspaper from the year 2000. And a signpost written on a coat hanger that says, in Hebrew, this space is occupied by Igor. So you can see it's not just about, the traces go back to containerization, the term used to coin global trade and globalization made possible by these containers. So global economy, occupation, immigration, and now what we see is our salvation, all embodied within this structure, and the structures you see around you. And so I feel that's the divine nature of debt. Then there's the debt one has to commerce in general, which I think is symbolized by the billboard downstairs. And again, like these caravans, that multiply everywhere, we have billboards that are springing up like mushrooms all over the Palestinian landscape. And And what they're selling is a dream that they're trying to use to replace our history. And so I found it very fitting in the same way that sheep follow aimlessly. I felt that we have the tendency to do the same and follow aimlessly what's being advertised. So the sheep came together in this very organic manner that still, if you look closely, has seeds and birds from Palestine, with this cold commercial obscurity that disappears and reappears and squeezes the sheep from between its louvers and disappears again. And in the final room, there's a piece called Failing to Levant, which for me speaks to familial debt, or a debt that we find that bonds us to our tradition and our family. And so you see the original floor tile next to a piece of suspended tiles that were made by the same family in Memphis. And they are suspended in such a way that is something of a paradox. It's an anomaly. There's a chain hoist. It's incredibly heavy, but it's somehow being, instead of lifting, it's being weighed down by the burden of history and these bonds that are echoed in actually the geometry of the tile. So these are the three aspects of debt that I wanted to explore. Perhaps I should say something about the piece behind me, which is called Rawabi. I've been mentioning the buildings that cast shadows on all of these caravans, and perhaps the largest of them is called Rawabi, which is a new construction, actually built in lands that used to be Area C. So Area C is controlled by the Israelis, and Palestinians have no authority over Area C, but somehow these lands, which used to be commons, farmed by the villages around these hills, was somehow bequeathed to the Palestinian Authority. And a new Palestinian city, the first Palestinian city, has been built. It's currently under construction. Its name is Rawabi, and the camel jaw behind me shares the same name. And of course, the camel is a symbol of a traditional store of wealth that has been quite literally turned upside down. So I think there you have it. There you have the basics. Of course, there's a piece here in the room next door, which is corrugated goat skins, which I made after spending time in the Negev with the Bedouins there that are resisting, still resisting, being forced off of their traditional lands. Of course, corrugation you see everywhere, and you take it for granted. It's so invisible you don't notice it, but it is a material that was born out of military purposes in 1861 and has continued to serve mainly as low-income or cheap material for low-income housing for refugees and the dispossessed. And so I figured out a way to corrugate goats. And then there's the picture behind it, which is a snapshot, somewhat fictional snapshot, but very much based in reality, that I made into an oil painting, where you can see the corrugated billboards. And I found it striking that the billboards use the same material that refugee homes and the new constructions are using. So it all feels very much bound materially and tied together with this notion of death. So that's my brief 2 cents. If anybody has any questions, I will do my best to answer them. Does anybody have? Yes, please.
That's what Moshe Dayan said. We didn't say what he said.
I'm sorry. It is actually, his quote is actually written on the wall there, but he said, Yes, he said that in order to get rid of the Bedouins, we have to turn them into an urban proletariat. We have to take away their lands, essentially, give them nominal positions, laboring jobs, and put them in new houses. So specially constructed. Take them out of the tents, free up the countryside so that they can build Israeli settlements. Yes?
I think it's the dog driving. It shows that it's, the same idea of the tent is movable. And it's a case of the home and the house. The different driving way. The land is the house. It's different than the city. City, the people in the city and the village. They have home and they have
Right.
Yes, I think they don't share that. It's for them. It's their home.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. The land itself is their shelter.
Actually, all over the world.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's thriving ways.
Yeah. And we had a very strong tradition of commons in this sense,
Yes.
which we're seeing lost.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about the containerization
Well,
and in your discovery, and how did it feel when you were uncovering layers? Where this, how does this relate to the life of that container that's been traveling and then ending up in this preoccupied land?
well, the container itself is something that was designed to travel in the same way that the tent is. But you see, what happens is they end up in the West Bank, and that's it. It's a graveyard of containers, you could say.
So it's no longer traveling.
It's no longer traveling, it is settled. And what does that mean? It's no longer in circulation. Of course, in the context of settlements, that makes you think of how settlements are tied into the larger global economy. And so when I was photographing them and really looking into them and cutting them and finding little messages in Hebrew or little drawings of settlers or some very graphically violent messages, and right next to it, like a drawing of a child, and there's some Arabic text and then some English. You have to try to make sense of all of these layers. And for me, it's that's where the cutting became my practice. So it's almost as if the cross section, in order to really understand it, you have to slice it and look at the cross section.
And did it,
the coffee cup, Sohaib was asking me to explain about the coffee cup. It's a very simple piece, but it's essentially a coffee cup with a bakhur on top, frankincense, incense, which I've shaped into a little caravan. And the hope is that you light it and watch it burn. Yeah, the coffee cup, of course, symbolizes the Palestinian hilltop and the caravan on top. And there's the potential for it to change states. When something burns, it goes from a solid to a gas. And then state change is the hidden promise of that piece. And I think it would smell good. Yes, please.
The treadmill downstairs, the sheep films. What were you going for with that?
I didn't mention that. It's called the Black Goat Law. And again, this piece came out of my time with the Bedouins in the Negev. The Black Goat Law was legislation passed in order to force the Bedouins off the land. Essentially, the Israelis said it is illegal to graze goats in certain areas. where traditionally they have been. And it actually led to the endangering of the black goat species. It's not on the endangered list, or it was, and then it was taken off, but it actually had quite a devastating impact. And the treadmill, of course, for me, is this kind of urban activity. So instead of, you can imagine instead of a shepherd walking his goats, you can see him turning endlessly in this artificial loop. And across from it, you see an example of billboards that are going by advertising cheap mortgages. So it's a kind of a morbid, hypnotic endeavor that I think symbolizes the kind of blind movement that people who are in this kind of urban haze and go through. You see it in big cities all the time. I see it in New York all the time. And what's shocking is that we're witnessing it happening in Palestine now. You can see it. I can see it happening. It's like, you just want to say, get off the treadmill, or look at where you're moving. So that's what that piece is about.
I noticed in your photographs there's no people in the artistic position, or you can kind of
Yes, if you always focus on the person if it's in the shot, and I want you to focus on the caravan, because each one has a slight secret, and they're really interesting. And of course, this is just a small fraction. These caravans that you see here represent the caravans between my home and my studio, which is like a 10-minute drive away. So it's an ongoing series about this new terraforming that's happening.
I think it's hard and emotional to see the intruders, how they get there, how they start, together to the original people to start with. يعني بالعربي الإسرائيلي يبلشوا البيوت تبعهم يأتوا فيها أعطوها للسكان الأصليين عشان يبلشوا فيها الكرافات. I'm mentioning 48 and 40.
Yeah. No, I think so too. And I think I can't stress enough the horror of the occupation. Right? But we have to, at some point, especially now that we have a Palestinian Authority, start thinking outside of the current definitions and expanding them from occupation to control. Power, because you can occupy your own people. You can dispossess your own people, and this happens all over the world. This happens within cities, on two sides of a highway. You ask yourself, why is the highway built here and not there? And why is it rich and poor on one side and on the other? Or why the Indians have dispossessed the population from the Narmada Valley? Or why the Yangtze River was dammed at the cost of hundreds of thousands of farmers. So it's really, we really have to expand our definitions, and it's essential that we waste no time in doing that. Because we will lose everything that's traditional and beautiful, in my opinion.
Is this virtually for this exhibition, or did you show it somewhere else?
No, everything you've seen here was made under the patronage of Darat al Funun specifically for this exhibition. This is the first time it's been shown.
Are you planning to take this somewhere else?
Yes.
As a filmmaker, you will not be here next week when you project Palestine Peace. Can you tell us the influence of the years on the work? What can you say about your film that you will project in your absence?
Well, what I think is it next week? Palestine Blues, and that was my first film. It turned into a feature-length documentary. The films I was making prior to that were all installations, based in part on this idea of the rhizome, which Deleuze and Guattari write about. So I really, for me, I had such a troubled relationship with the moving image and representation and the way stories were told, the 3-act structure, for example, and the politics of these things, that I felt compelled to explore the formal elements that go into these stories. We take the story for granted, but what about the camera and the way it works, and the projector and the way it works? And I started asking myself questions, like why does film run vertically through a projector instead of horizontally? Why is there only one light source? Why does the film run at 24 frames per second instead of, I don't know, 23? Why do we see this as a representation of reality? So as a film student, I was editing with the steam-backed moviola machines, and I began to take them apart. I began taking things apart well before I took this caravan apart. It's part of my nature. But so I took the projector apart and I removed the shutter and I made the film run horizontally instead of vertically through multiple projectors, and the film speed changes. It fluctuates between 0 and 100 frames per second depending on how close you stand to the image, how you affect the image. What you see is not reality, it's you seeing it, and it actually changes the thing you're looking at. This is called the Heisenberg principle. So that's the kind of film I was making. And I went to Palestine in 2001 to make one of these. I got a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, and I was making one of these, just filming crossing a checkpoint. And on my weekends, I was exploring water-rich areas in Palestine, villages that have artesian springs, because I wanted to look at the conflict in terms of water, something that's very far, universal, far removed from religion or national struggle. I just wanted to look at resources and the powers that are imposed upon them. So one day I was in a village called Jayus that has 7 artesian springs, and Israeli bulldozers came over the hill and started uprooting the olive groves and orange orchards for the construction of the apartheid wall. And the farmers asked me to tell their story, and I just found myself at odds with my aesthetic sensibility and my politics. I couldn't tell the farmers, I'm going to put your story on a horizontally, Deleuzian running apparatus that maybe 100 people might see in a white cubic gallery. I couldn't do that. So I really had to be confronted with their needs, as well as trying to be true to my own. And so the film that came out is called Palestine Blues. And it's maybe for filmmakers in the audience, you might recognize that it's a play on a 3-act structure. So apart from its content, I found that by adopting the 3-act structure, I actually made a Hollywood movie, and then I started slicing it and cutting it and removing the signposts of a traditional Hollywood 3-act film. And so what you see is, again, a sliced up narrative. But I find that to be the most fitting narrative.
I'd say many artists, especially sometimes the last 10 years, the Palestinian artists are so different than before. Before war or mythology, the story, and now, especially art compared to Palestinian art, is used of 1 minute or material from the camp, used in like land or construction in the world, like in work there. And I don't know, sometimes I feel repeated, same, used some from party, before used it from the land, from the tree, now used it from the camp. Today I saw the work for the Singapore. He used the 1 unit like Kazan, like that, and 1 unit from the camp, like 1 unit from Kappa, 1 unit from. I feel, yes, I feel something like repeated, but different image, but same concept.
Well, I don't like working with things that are so culturally specific, although I did make a Greece piece, it's kind of an ironic piece. But I think we shouldn't think so specifically about camps and things like that, because these are universal issues, right? And I like to use ready-made industrial objects, and they, for me, speak to the same issues. I think this piece would work in many countries. I mean, I'm speaking particularly about the billboard. I don't think it's specific to a refugee camp or something like that, but it speaks to a larger trend, which is a neoliberal trend. And it certainly affects more than my country. But I have seen what you described.
The same applied to the Lebanese artists. People on depends on.
This is used in Lebanon and also.
You also have to consider. You have to also consider the art market when you think about that. You know,
I
because
feel the small only I feel this is a small used some part from the camp, some part from the caravan, or this is a wire for this area. Use this material, use this unit. The last 10 years, not like that. You think you need, I feel.
The Egyptians use the pyramids for the last.
Yes, it's changed now. But I look a lot of, I visited a lot of in the last few years, and for Palestinian-American, so I used to say, only this is Christians. The certain little bit I feel small. There's more than layers behind this.
Is the question that there's a shift between, I don't understand the question, between
No, the question is only I asked why the last 10 years most artists, Palestinian-American, used material from the camp from outside, used in artwork. Artwork a lot like that. They see today, I said, he have also like Caravan and Hazan for water in Palestine, and he make a lot of photos. 1 unit and a lot of photos, different cases and different mood, different composition, and also same way, same concept, different image or different the building or different but same concept. This is only I asked why this is a certain you have. I don't know what people know in this area.
I don't know. I mean, I think I think it's natural for artists to use materials from their environments if that's what we're speaking about. So it's not the material, but how you use it.
It's a meaning behind it, not only material.
Exactly. But this is natural for artists to use what they find around them.
An artist must discover you.
Absolutely. You have to show it in a different way, or
See it.
Mostly I see it's not container.
Yeah, they start as shipping containers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't know whether they want to ship.
Yes. Yeah, no, they end up there. They don't go anywhere else.
I know that. I got the idea. They don't.
Yeah, but I think that's very interesting. That they're containers actually.
Yeah,
shipping
containers.
containers.
Shipping containers. And it has members, by the way, all over the world.
Yeah. Have you had enough?
Congratulations.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.